Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome on Kate Hubbard to discuss Bess of Hardwick. Kate is a writer and editor specialising in historical biography. She began by writing for children, including short biographies of Charlotte Bronte and Queen Victoria. She later wrote Serving Victoria, an exploration of Queen Victoria's court, which was shortlisted for the Costa Prize. Her most recent book, Devices and Desires, examines Bess of Hardwick and the world of Elizabethan architecture and patronage. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Kate. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So today we are discussing the formidable Bess of Hardwick. But before we get on to Bess, I thought we could talk a little bit about yourself. So I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yes, I work as I'm a writer and an editor, and I started my writing life writing for children. I wrote a couple of short biographies of Charlotte Bronte and Queen Victoria for children, and then I wrote a sort of historical, sort of fictionalized diary, really, so sort of historical fiction about Anastasia Romanov, the youngest Romanov daughter. And then I sort of switched to writing sort of grown-up books. And my first book was a book about Queen Victoria's court. So it was looked at 6 of her courtiers and sort of their experiences and lives at court. And then I went on to write about Bess of Hardwick. So Bess of Hardwick was the book I most recently written.
What inspired you to write a book on Bess?
Well, I was mostly, I think the idea came, and why I became interested in her was because I went to her house, or her surviving house, because she built more than one house, and her surviving house is Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. And it's a really extraordinary house. And the first thing you see when you approach it is these enormous giant stone initials, ES, which were her initials, Elizabeth Shrewsbury, all across the turrets of this house. And it's not an enormous house, but it's a very unusual and kind of wonderful house. And I was intrigued that it had been built by a woman, and built by a woman who was quite elderly when she was in her 70s when she started it. And so I was interested in her house, and then through the house I sort of came to her.
I mean, I visited Hardwick last month and I was blown away of how exquisite it was. It was amazing.
Yes, it's quite something.
So moving on to Bess, could you tell us when she was born and who were her parents?
Yes. So she was born, it's not absolutely certain when exactly her exact birth date, but she was born in probably 1520 or possibly 1521. And her parents were called John and Elizabeth Hardwick. And they were Derbyshire gentry, not especially rich. They had a house which was actually where Hardwick Hall is today, and they had a bit of land. So they were Derbyshire gentry.
What do we know about Bess's early life?
Well, she grew up. She had several sisters and a brother, and they probably had fairly modest lives. They were certainly not wealthy. She would have had quite a rudimentary education because she wasn't aristocratic. And she would have probably just learnt the basics of accounting, reading, writing, a little bit of embroidery, maybe some herbal medicine. And we know little about her early life because the records aren't there. And it's only later, when she became a known and a more important personage that she sort of enters the records. And so she probably lived a rather quiet and ordinary life in this house, which was a small manor house at Hardwick, with her parents and siblings.
When was Bess married for the first time?
So she married in when she was about 20, so around about 1541, and she married a younger man. He was actually only 13. He was called Robert Barlow, and he was the son of some neighboring gentry neighbors, essentially. And so it was almost certainly a marriage of a business arrangement. It was arranged by the parents. It was to do with land. It was about joining together two small estates, and it probably wasn't even consummated given how young Robert was, and he actually died when he was 14. So it was a brief marriage.
Do we know what Bess got up to after her brief first marriage?
Well, that's something that's sort of lost to the record. We don't know for sure. And she had a long battle she began a long battle in the courts to get what was known as a widow's jointure, which was 1/3 of her husband's estate. And it was initially she did not receive this from Robert Barlow's family, and she had to sort of fight for it. So much of her time was spent going to court, and in the end, she actually won her case and got that portion of his estate. And she probably went and became a sort of like a kind of gentlewoman or a lady in waiting to an aristocratic family, possibly the Greys, who were linked, had some family links. And she then was through that or through them she probably met Sir William Cavendish, who became her next husband.
So when did Bess marry William Cavendish?
So she married him in 1547.
What do we know about their marriage? How many children did they have?
Yes. Well, they had 8 children. 2 of them died young, so six surviving children. And Sir William was not unlike Bess in his background. He was also from the gentry. He had come to court. He was a man who did well for himself, and he made something of himself. He began working for Cardinal Wolsey, then he worked for Thomas Cromwell, then he had a court position under Henry VIII. He was involved in the dissolution of the monasteries, and in the process he became a rich man. And so he was a sort of quite rich, powerful, on the make, energetic. And he met Bess, who was about 13 years younger than him, and but it was a good match, and they were quite well suited. They had a similar sort of drive and ambition, and an interest in building, in fact.
I was going to say we start to see Bess's interest in building in her second marriage because they start to really develop Chatsworth, don't they?
They do, and the interesting thing about that is that William Cavendish did not come from Derbyshire. His estate was in Hertfordshire, and I without knowing for sure, I'm sure it was Bess who persuaded him to buy Chatsworth, and which was then had a very unexceptional house on it, and which they knocked down, and they proceeded to build this really enormous rectangle, a courtyard house, so with around a quadrangle, and on 2 stories, very, very large. And it's the Chatsworth that's there today is not the original Elizabethan Chatsworth. So we only have pictures that show what the house looked like, but it was an extremely grand house, and the building of it went on for many years, long after Sir William Cavendish died.
I was going to say, I've recently gone to Chatsworth, kind of following Bess's story, so to speak.
Yes.
And there's in the guidebook a tapestry of what they think the Elizabethan Chatsworth
looked like.
and I
Yes.
thought it looked very similar to Hardwick. You can tell there's a similar taste there going on in both of them.
Yes, yes. It was actually bigger than Hardwick. And Hardwick is not built around a courtyard, so it's a sort of Hardwick is a sort of different model. But one thing they have in common, which is sort of important, or was important to Bess, was the staterooms, which were the grand rooms where you would have received important visitors, were on the second floor, not the first floor, and they had these very large windows, and that was a sort of innovation to have your staterooms on the second floor, and it was something they did at Chatsworth, and it's something that Bess continued and recreated at Hardwick.
So you mentioned earlier that obviously William dies in their marriage. He died in 1557.
Yes.
What position did this leave Bess in?
Well, it left her, in fact, in quite a precarious position because she had 6 young children to support, and it turned out that Sir William had not unlike many men of his day was fairly unscrupulous and had definitely been embezzling money or kind of sort of maneuvering with his accounts, so that he had a large debt, and he'd basically been siphoning off some money for himself, and there was a debt of around £5,000, which was at the time a very large sum of money, and that debt was hanging over Bess's head and needed to be repaid, and this was a debt to the crown, and she didn't really have the means of paying it, and it turned out that there wasn't, because of Sir William's rather dodgy business methods, there wasn't a great deal of money at all, and so she was a young widow with 6 children and a debt, and so she had to act quickly in order to sort of to save herself and her family.
I was going to say that's quite a lot to deal with, isn't it? Especially as a young woman with
Yes,
6 kids in the
yes,
Tudor period.
yes, 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 yes.
So we know that Bess does marry again for a third time. How did she secure this match?
Well, she married someone called her third husband was called Sir William St. Low, and he was from Somerset, and he was, unlike Bess and unlike William Cavendish, his background was he was aristocratic, so he was from a different class. We don't know exactly where they met. They probably met at court, because Bess still had, she had her London house that she'd lived in with Sir William. She still had links. She had links to court, and Sir William had a position at court. This was now under Elizabeth I, who'd come to the throne, and he was captain of the guard and chief butler of England. So they probably met in court circles, and he was clearly very taken by Bess. And I don't suspect there was a great deal of love on her part, but he definitely offered a way out of her predicament. And he had plenty of money. He had huge tracts of land in the West Country, and he was very generous, and he paid off her debt. He looked after her children. He provided dowries for her daughters. So he was in many ways an excellent husband, although it doesn't seem as if she was quite happy to spend a lot of time apart from him. And in fact, she spent a lot of time at Chatsworth continuing with the building of her house, which was completely funded by Sir William St. Low. So I don't think it was a love match, and certainly not on her part, but it served her well.
Did Bess's third marriage elevate her position more at the Tudor court? She became friendlier with Elizabeth.
Yes, she did, because she was very much, thrown in Elizabeth's path, and they were friendly. And I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe to say they were friends might be stretching it, but they were certainly on good terms. Yes.
Obviously, you said this probably wasn't a love match on Bess's part, but sadly, another one of her husbands dies. How
Yes.
did this make her one of the wealthiest women in England?
Well, because um, she had Sir William had actually made over to her, which was unusual, and a lot of his land, they were known as the Western lands, which were mostly in Somerset. So she'd been, and that which had been put into her name, and she also had, as I mentioned earlier, when your husband died as a widow, you were entitled to a third of his income from his estate. So then she got a third from William St. Low, which was in addition to the portion she'd already received from Sir William Cavendish and her first husband. So she had sort of three lots of widows portions, and but through St. Low, St. Low left her a wealthy woman, and because he was wealthy himself, and the fact that this land had been made over to her and not to his own children caused a certain amount of um, upset and anger, and indeed she was accused by his children of that there were rumors that actually she'd poisoned him, or there'd been some sort of underhand dealing going on, but I think that was unlikely to be the case. But you could say that he sort of conveniently died and left her rich, and so she was left with an income of about £1,600 a year, which I wish I knew what that was in today's money, but it's a lot.
Say,
it would be a lot.
A lot of money. She was a rich woman.
It definitely was, yes.
What do we know about Bess after her third marriage? How is she spending her time?
Well, she carried on. She carried on with working on building her building program at Chatsworth. So she was certainly doing that. She was ambitious for herself, and she was ambitious for her children. So she was very keen that her children should marry well, and so she spent a certain amount of time kind of trying to find good, suitable, wealthy husbands or wives, and so she was, by this point she was definitely a kind of woman of consequence, and she was on good terms with Elizabeth, with Queen Elizabeth. She was rich in her own right. She could move between Derbyshire and London, and she didn't need to marry again, in fact, but she did.
I mean, I was just going to ask, did she need to get married for a fourth time because she didn't
No,
have to?
she absolutely didn't have to. She had plenty of money and plenty of status, really. So she didn't need to, and she quite possibly regretted marrying for the fourth time. But the man she married, who was the Earl of Shrewsbury, and she married him in 1567. I mean, he was one of the sort of principal English earls. So although she didn't lack status, this made her a countess, and he owned enormous chunks of the Midlands, and a great many houses, castles, huge amounts of land, rich in mining and natural resources. And so it was a sort of another level. She was kind of propelled into a different, even a sort of, I suppose, grander life, and with as a countess, as the Countess of Shrewsbury. And he was initially, anyway, very devoted. I mean, it was a late marriage for but she was in her 40s, and as was he, and they both had children from previous marriages.
Was it a fond marriage? Especially at the beginning, were they quite happy with each other?
Yes, I think they were initially happy, and it soured their marriage. And Bess's letters tend to be rather sort of businesslike, and she's quite often she sends her husband her letters slightly. The tone of them is a sort of list of things she wants, demands, not necessarily for money, but perhaps for sort of building supplies, or a certain kind of cloth, or fresh walnuts, or whatever. so she didn't she was there was quite a lot of demands made on him, and his letters to her are full of affection and endearments, and he you get a sort of slight sense that it was not, in that sense, it was not, their marriage was not kind of perfectly balanced. He was the more adoring of the two, and I think she basically carried on with her projects in Derbyshire, and didn't necessarily spend a great deal of time by her husband's side. And but then their marriage went sort of seriously wrong as the years went on, and partly that was due to Mary, Queen of Scots.
I mean,
It
you've
was a
brought me
spanner in the
excellently on. I was going to say she really did throw a spanner in the works. So obviously,
Yes,
Mary, Queen of Scots, came over to England and thought Elizabeth I would help her. Obviously, that did not happen. She
yes,
was imprisoned by Elizabeth, and George is picked to be her captor.
yes.
What kind of position did this put Bess in? Because it was incredibly awkward.
Yes, it was awkward because I mean, George, the Earl of Shrewsbury, he was sort of as much a kind of a captive as a captor. I mean, he was Mary's jailer, but that position meant that his own life became extremely limited and constrained, and as a consequence, so did Bess's, because wherever, although she wasn't always by her husband's side, she was supposed to be by, and he certainly wanted her by his side. And um, Mary, who was there, who was held captive under Shrewsbury's care for a long time, for 15 years, and she was basically sort of shunted between his various properties in the Midlands, his various houses and castles, and which was partly why he'd been chosen as her captor in the first place, because he had various properties. They had to be. Mary wasn't just Mary, but she had an enormous entourage. I mean, often around sort of 60 people with her, all of whom had to be accommodated and fed. And then these properties had to be cleaned, and so at that point she'd be taken off to another of Shrewsbury's castles. And so it was no small thing, and it was a big expense. And Mary, and so Bess was sort of expected to be, to be there too, but also not to be overly involved with Mary, Queen of Scots, because there's a lot of fear that Mary, Queen of Scots, who was loved scheming and was endlessly plotting to her escape, and so there was a lot of kind of, on the Queen's part, there's a lot of anxiety about access to Mary, and the fact that people were trying to smuggle letters. And so Bess was allowed access to her, but she wasn't supposed to be on to become up to she wasn't supposed to get too intimate with Mary, basically. And initially she did spend a lot of time in Mary's company, and they seem to have got on rather well, and they spent many hours doing embroidery together, and in fact created some rather wonderful textiles, which can still be seen, some of which are at Hardwick. And there was probably Bess also, who was quite a schemer herself, did become involved in some of Mary's schemes. At least that's what rumors claimed that, and the Queen became suspicious. And then the rumors began that Mary was actually having an affair with Shrewsbury, and which was, I think, unlikely. But Mary was extremely charming and actually extremely attractive, and she was in Shrewsbury's care for 15 years. It was a long time, and he may well have softened towards her. Doesn't mean to say he fell in love with her. And he did make some efforts to make her life a little less wretched, and provide some sort of amusement for her. But Bess very much exploited these rumors, because it was a way of kind of causing trouble, and she actually, I think was sort of, didn't, or at least she didn't claim this publicly, but I think her, she was quite keen to make trouble for Shrewsbury, and so she actually rather encouraged these rumours that there was some relationship between him and the Queen of Scots.
What do you think her motive was for that?
Well, it's not really quite clear. She possibly was wanted to discredit him. She, I think, she definitely turned against the Queen of Scots from initially being on rather kind of friendly terms, and she had she had ambitions for one of her granddaughters called Arbella, who was actually had a blood link to Mary Queen of Scots, and she felt that Mary Queen of Scots was not helpful in promoting Arbella's interests. So Bess always had her own agenda, and I think she felt that Mary certainly wasn't going to help her in that respect. And I think then by this point, she'd also come to her relations with Shrewsbury had broken down really entirely, and so they more or less had sort of separate lives. But then that also led to kind of endless rows and arguments and battles about money and property.
In the 1590s, Bess purchases back the Hardwick estate.
Yes,
Could you tell
from
us
her
why she
brother.
decided to build the new hall?
Well, she doesn't actually start building the new hall until she becomes a widow, until after Shrewsbury's death. She buys the Hardwick estate from her brother, who was sort of the opposite of her and was entirely feckless and managed to lose whatever money he had. And she bought the Hardwick estate, and she actually started building um, a house there called Hardwick Old Hall, which is still there as a ruin, and it's quite a sort of spectacular ruin, and was a very large house. And so she started with the old hall, and that was more or less completed, and then but it wasn't even quite finished when she started to build yet another house immediate right next door, which is Hardwick New Hall, which seems sort of eccentric to have, you've got one enormous house and then you build another one right next door to it. But I I feel she clearly wanted the Hardwick estate for herself. It was her, it was the place of her birth. She had strong feelings about it. Hardwick Old Hall was in many ways a rather amazing house, and in terms of it was extremely highly decorated and had wonderful stone carvings and in its interiors. But it was perhaps not. It was slightly flawed, I think, as a house. She didn't see it as it wasn't. I think the house she dreamt of, and I think she decided she was going to have another go, and she was going to sort of build the house she'd always wanted, which was Hardwick New Hall. And I think she really built it entirely for herself because she didn't need a house. She had Chatsworth, she had Hardwick Old Hall. She didn't lack for houses, and I think it was, and she didn't begin it until she was, widowed for the fourth time, and it was her final project. It was her swan song. I think it's what she sort of wanted to be remembered by, and it is. Although it was by no means her only activity, because she had a great many other activities apart from building. But I think building was a great passion.
How did Bess spend the latter half of her life? Obviously, she's building Hardwick New Hall. Is she doing anything else during this time as well?
Well, she was managing her. I mean, it was really. I think it was not. It wouldn't be untrue to say it was an empire. I mean, she had this, thanks to her various inheritances from her husbands. She had she owned a lot of land, a lot of properties. She had sort of timber business. She had a lot of coal mines. She had lead mines. She had glass works. She had a very flourishing money lending business. So she was a businesswoman. She was a kind of Midlands businesswoman. And she was very much hands on. And so whatever she'd inherited from her husband, I think the point about her is that she used those inheritances she built on them, and she enriched herself, and she was, she was a clever businesswoman. So she was doing all this alongside building Hardwick Hall.
Do we know when Bess died, and do we know the cause of her death?
She died in 1608, and so she lived to see James the First come to the throne. And she died at Hardwick. She died in her bed, and in under in it was February or late January, very very cold. She lay under many quilts and blankets, and the bed was heavily kind of insulated with thick curtains. And she really, I think she died of, she was around 87. She died of old age. I mean, she was suffering from some sort of abdominal pain. Possibly she had some kind of stomach cancer, but essentially she was old. She was still completely sharp in her mind, and she was still, making legacies and changing, writing little, changing, making changes to her will, and she hadn't sort of she hadn't let go, but she was frail and old, and age. So that was a, for the time, that was a very that was a great age.
What legacy has Bess left in history?
Well, I think her most visible legacy is her house, because it's a sort of perfect house in many ways, um, and architecturally, and the way its interiors, and it's a very, I mean, she had an architect, so it wasn't entirely her. It's in terms of design, and she worked closely with craftsmen and stonemasons and so on. But I think it is a really remarkable house, and I think that is her legacy. But I think she also stands as, I mean, she's sort of proof of what you could achieve as a woman in 16th century England, and what you could achieve was a lot. And she, I think, as a kind of determined, ambitious, strong-minded, individual, I think what she achieved at that time was kind of extraordinary. And she wasn't the only woman builder, but I don't think there'd been anyone before her who'd built houses in the same way, or in fact who had kind of created and sort of managed a kind of business empire.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve? Something that someone says and you're like, no, that's incorrect, or that bothers me?
No, I don't think I have really. I think just sort of inaccuracy, I suppose, in general. Yeah.
If you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
I think I would have quite liked to have attended the coronation of Queen Victoria,
Hmm.
and in 1837, because I think it was a moment of, there was this little tiny figure, 18 years old, really a child, and coming after all the string of Hanoverians. And I think it was a time of it was a time of great hope. I think people had felt a great sense of that it was a new era, and which it was, and there was this sort of child queen, and it was a kind of moment of change and hopefulness.
Have you got a favourite book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
I think uh, A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel, I would say, which is a book, a novel set in the French Revolution. And it absolutely makes that time and the various key people involved in the revolution totally alive. And it's a very wonderful book.
If you were hosting a dinner party, which historical figure would you invite and why?
I think I would invite um, I would invite Lord Melbourne, who was Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister, but who really was a Whig and sort of harked back more to the 18th century than the 19th. And I think he was a man of great wit and charm, and I think would have been a very companionable dinner companion.
I think that's a really good choice, actually. I think he's so interesting.
Mm.
And finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
No, I've struggled to come up with something. I think it's interesting that in medieval England, their sleep patterns were very were interesting, and that they sort of had two different. They didn't sleep like what we think of as a good night's sleep. They actually got up at 4 a.m, and then they had another sleep in the day. So they had these two short periods of sleep.
Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing Bess of Hardwick.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.